Good afternoon to everyone that's joined us in the EMEA region in UK, and or is it afternoon for you guys in the US? So good afternoon, maybe. I know we normally run our LinkedIn lives a little bit earlier, so it's great to run this a little bit later and have more of the, I suppose, the US audience. And it's a really interesting topic that we're going to be discussing today. Obviously, we've got a change in government in the US. So we're going to be talking about the major policy changes coming for US payrolls for 2025. So before we start, my name is Melanie Pitsey, and I'm happy or excited to introduce Pete Eisberg, who's just finished a very long, illustrious career in the US as Vice President, Government Relations with ADP in the United States. And you've served some other roles for the payroll community in the US as well. He is well versed in policy changes that occur when new presidents take over. So his comments do not reflect any positions of his former employer. I'm happy to have you here, Pete.
Thank you.
And obviously, for those of you that have joined our LinkedIn lives previously, we have Mike Bear, who's managing editor, was the managing editor of Bloomberg Tax, overseeing payroll library and other payroll resources. For 3 decades. I didn't realise it was that long, Mike. So
yep.
Good experience. He remains an observer of all things going on in the payroll community in the US and globally, and with Beer Unlimited advises and writes on payroll communications, compliance and operations. And obviously you work with us at the GPA, so welcome, Mike. So
thank you.
So before we start, it'll be great to hear where everyone's from, if we do have more of a US audience, but I hope we do have an international audience, because I know there are people based in EMEA who have responsibility for the US. If you do have any questions, please put them in the comment box. I was running through this with Mike and Pete, and I had a few questions as we went along, just what some of the acronyms meant. So if you do have any questions, want to understand a little bit better, then please feel free to ask. You know, we have the experts live, so let's make sure we do that. Okay, so we have President Trump taking over. I think, is it on Monday?
That's right.
Yeah. What, if anything, may happen right away that payroll people in the US should know about? So Mike, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, there's normally, and this happened with when President Biden took over on January 20th, 2021, was that he issued an order to immediately pause and review all regulatory actions that were underway in the agency. And so we should expect the Trump administration to at least do the same thing with that. Everything's going to get reviewed. And I feel pretty strongly that the Labor Department rulings during the Biden administration that are in effect or that are proposed in the, let's just say, the pipeline to become effective, especially, say, the employment definition for coverage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So who's an independent contractor? That rule is in effect, and we can expect some activity on that fairly early on, I think, to kind of change that back. What happened was the Biden administration had reversed a different interpretation of how to determine who was an independent contractor and thus exempt from coverage under the main labor law that protects workers in the U.S., the Fair Labor Standards Act. And then, so what ended up happening was they changed some of the parameters back. That rule was effective earlier in 2024. It's been challenged, but actually recently there was a court in New Mexico that I read that did not halt this rule. So it looks like the Trump administration, in order to kind of take things back over, they're going to have to do something fairly soon to eliminate that. We also have had an overtime rule that was basically overturned by the courts. and a tip credit rule that was also overturned by the courts late in 2024. Those rules are still there, but it's a question of will the Trump administration take action to issue new rules, or just allow these things to revert back to the rules that were in place. There may be some activity later on this year. So Lori Chavez DeRemer is the nominee. President Trump has determined for Secretary of Labor. Keith Sonderling, who oversaw the wage and hour division of DOL, under the first Trump administration, he's slated to be her deputy. And so he's the one who kind of changed that independent contractor rule under the Trump administration. So we can really kind of expect that is going to revert back to the interpretation of the first Trump administration. Confirmation hearings are not yet scheduled on these folks. They're not really as controversial picks as some of the other picks President Trump has chosen to lead agencies. So we think it's pretty clear that these folks are going to be approved to take over, but it's going to take a few months to get something going in the new regime. While I'm saying that, though, the new administration brings with it some real clear objectives, and objectives that could be impacting payroll. There is this factor of unpredictability that we need to be aware of, and so keep your eyes open. And Pete, you have some comments about maybe stuff that is likely not to change.
Well, I think you made some very good points, and it is effectively kind of standard operating procedure for any incoming administration, especially when there's a change in administration with different views on policies, to reconsider and sometimes withdraw or repeal recent enactments, recent changes. So, for those interested in, payroll operations and how might we be affected, we want to think about, what changed recently that might be further tinkered with under a new administration. The one large one that came to mind for me was retirement plan policy, and that was changed in 2022. There was a Secure 2.0, a second version of legislation that included, literally like 90 specific changes to retirement plan administration, retirement plan policy for employers and employees. And, affected organizations that have been working on this since 2022 are now asking themselves, well, should we pause what we're doing? Is it possible that this may change? So just a couple of, quick examples, some specifics. In 2025, the catch-up contributions for those who, that's for those over age 50 who are making extra retirement plan contributions, so sort of, building up their retirement savings as much as possible. If they make more than $145,000 in the prior year, their retirement plan contributions must be on a Roth basis or after-tax basis. And that's new. It's effective in 2025. There was just an IRS regulation published on this last week, in fact, on January 10th. So is that going to change? Another example from Secure 2.0, the retirement plan, is that there's automatic enrollment and automatic escalation mandates that are now taking effect in 2025. And that is that any 401k plan or similar retirement plan that was established after 2022, they have to automatically enroll employees and automatically increase the percentage deduction by 1% annually up to, say, 15%. I mean, employees can opt out of this, but the question for us today is, would the Trump administration coming in want to change any of that? And so we're looking at that question, and I think the answer for the retirement plan question is no, not that we've heard. In fact, we think the converse is probably true. They're very concerned about controlling spending, fiscal sanity, for lack of a better word. We expect to embrace things like Rothification. Let's make retirement plan contributions generally after tax. Why are they pre-tax? Because that arguably subsidizes those folks who are already wealthy. Is that the right thing to do? So we do expect there to be some further tinkering in retirement plan administration, but no need to immediately pause what you're doing there. Mike, you mentioned earlier a very important point CFPB. What was that?
Well, yeah, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau has a rule that there's a relatively new practice in payroll called earned wage access. That's really getting some legs here in the United States, and I know overseas there are a number of operators doing that as well, which is essentially allowing employees, in many cases through employers, to request pay before their scheduled payday that they've already earned. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is obviously a watchdog for financial operations and banks and things like that, they have recently proposed labeling many of these programs as actual straight-on loans or credit. And it's a proposed interpretive rule. It has not been finalized. I keep looking at it every day. We do not have any final action on that particular topic yet, but the proposal is out there. This is one of the things, if it remains a proposal, that's going to be frozen, reviewed. The previous Trump administration had taken a more receptive approach that these programs were not credit covered by the Truth in Lending Act. And so some of the things involved with being covered in the Truth in Lending Act mean that if they're considered credit, that has to, the operators have to go through a number of hoops to register folks, to qualify folks, and things like that. Right now, it's a fairly streamlined process with most of these earned wage access providers. Most of them are third parties that work with employers. Again, this has been a program that has been becoming more and more popular in the last few years. So I would expect if there should be something relatively soon that would maybe pull that back. Right now, I don't know who is going to be leading that bureau, but we do know that the current head, Rohit Chopra, has said he's going to resign on Monday. So that's the status of that one, Pete.
Can I just interrupt? Could you just explain for those that may not know what Secure 2.0 is?
Sure. Secure 2.0, which I mentioned, is one piece of legislation affecting U.S. employer retirement plan administration. So there are a couple of legislative bills that are recently enacted there and that are in the process of being implemented this year. But Mike, back to your point, it's actually a very interesting topic, and one of the few actual technology improvements that came to payroll in recent years. But there is a big regulatory question, which is is it lending? Does it constitute lending if recipients are just getting their own earnings prior to the scheduled payday? I mean, who said that payday can only be twice a month? Why not every day? So now it can be technically, and the question for regulators is, do we consider this to be lending? It's also complicated because it's a federal and state question. So we have had half a dozen states enact laws, including Kansas, Missouri, Nevada, South Carolina, Wisconsin. They've all passed legislation that does not consider earned wage access to be lending. So what happens if you have a federal CFPB rule out there that kind of implies that we think this is lending, and the rest of the states, again, there's 55 states or 45 states that need to consider, do we do something about this? Do they follow CFPB lead? Does the CFPB message change under the Trump administration? I think you're right, and they probably will change that somehow. But it's an important question because if all firms, if they deem this to be a form of lending, then all the earned wage access providers would need to become licensed under state law as lenders, which is hugely expensive. And so
right, it would change their business model, Pete.
Exactly. It's today it's free of charge for the most part, unless you want like same day instant credit to your bank account. If you're okay with the next day credit to your account, it's generally free of charge. That may no longer be the case if there's a heavy regulatory burden coming because of the CFPB ruling, because the states adopt that, and because EWA providers then need to be regulated as lenders, that gets very expensive. It's probably no longer going to be a free option for people.
Right, free and efficient as well. And I think, Pete, we should mention that there's a preponderance of evidence out there, studies done that show employees are very receptive to this. And these are voluntary programs. This is a voluntary program, but they're very receptive to it and have actually expressed that this is helping them with their finances to kind of cover them between paydays in many ways, so that they're not taking out, say, predatory payday loans, which are super high interest rates, or running up their credit cards, or having in the United States, we have an issue with banks charging overdraft fees if there's not enough money in the account. And those things are ameliorated by programs just like this. And it's a very popular with those folks that do take this up. And if things change, they won't have that flexibility anymore.
Yeah. And just to close this out, get back to Melanie's original question. I mean, President Trump, on the first day of his first administration, 2017, issued 14 executive orders, which was kind of mind-blowing at the time. President Biden came in on his first day of office and exceeded that. So guess what's going to happen on Monday? It's not going to be 14 or 17. It's going to be what's on the Trump administration's website is they're going to do 100 executive orders or presidential memoranda. So there's going to be a lot to chew on. But does it affect payroll is the other question. I think most of the topics are going to deal with things like border security, education, return to office for federal employees, energy policy, such as oil drilling permits and electronic vehicle mandates. But these generally aren't going to immediately affect payroll. So we're kind of on a, let's watch carefully, but I wouldn't expect anything of direct, immediate impact.
Yeah, we do know that there's going to be some direct impact for foreign people living here who are not valid foreign workers. Let's put it that way. This could limit, on foreign. Could be some aspects of these memorandum or executive orders that could limit foreign workers, and that will down the line have an impact on some payroll operations. Although I've read that advisors are split on the issue of skilled foreign workers. There's a special visa that the H-1 visa here that allows skilled foreign workers to come in and there's some provisions. There's some specific provisions surrounding that, how they qualify, how an employer can qualify to bring in a foreign worker instead of hiring somebody who's an indigenous U.S. citizen. But there's advisors are split on whether or not that is going to be a need some changing up. And we do know that, for example, some high-tech firms, leaders of high-tech firms, I'll mention the name, Elon Musk, he those firms use these skilled foreign workers. So if they have the ear of the president, they might not have too much of an impact there on the ability to bring in foreign workers.
We have a couple of questions. If you guys, is this a good time to ask them?
Sure.
Actually, let me just do a different one first. Sorry, we have an influx of questions, which is great. So thanks, everyone. If earned wage access is proved, does this mean it would be a voluntary program for employers?
Earned wage, I'll take that, Pete. Earned wage access has always been a voluntary program. It's never been that the employees determine they want to participate in. So they can choose not to participate in that and then just continue to get paid on the payday, or they can choose to be involved in one of these programs and be able to request some of their earnings as they've, since they've already earned those amounts. So it is a voluntary program.
Well, To clarify, it's voluntary both on the part of the employer and the employee. So the employer has first dibs. They can decide, I'm going to offer this or I'm not. If they do offer it, then employees have the option of, am I going to take this or not? If the employee is interested in it, but the employer doesn't offer it, it's not available to them.
Right. And this is something, Melanie, that's spreading throughout the globe now. As you might have heard over there in the UK, there are a number of operators there that have sprung up. So
it's a popular subject to talk about over in the EMEA region and actually APAC. So based on your experience, how soon do you anticipate changes to legislation that could affect specific payroll topics due to the change in administration?
Let me just mention that we will get to that because I think there's an obvious big target that's going to happen this upcoming year. So we'll spend some time on that in a minute.
Okay. So should we just go on to the next question then, shall we? Yeah. We've got quite a few. So if there are any questions that I don't manage to ask during this LinkedIn Live, we will come back to you because obviously we have your, we'll direct message you on LinkedIn, or I will add my email address and you can contact me directly and I can share them with my compete later on. But anyway, let's get back to it. So talk about the impact this Department of Government Efficiency may have on payroll operations. What is the possible effect on the agencies that regulate the payroll requirements? I can imagine there's going to be a lot going on.
Let me start that one, I guess, if you don't mind, Mike. But I'll say to begin, it's not a bad idea. Like somebody should be looking for programs and agencies that are really no longer needed or could be streamlined on an ongoing basis. So, the federal government is acknowledged to be spending, much more than we're taking in every year, which gets costly. Interest costs from the federal budget have exploded to almost $900 billion in 2024, and that's up from the low 400 billions in 2012 through 2017. So big increase in federal interest payments. Now about 20% of all federal taxes goes just to pay interest on the national debt. So we have less money to pay for programs, less money to pay for benefits, national defense, other priorities. And now we have this Department of Governmental Efficiency group. It's just an advisory committee. I think that's my nutshell answer here is it doesn't have any authority to do anything except make recommendations. It'll be interesting to see those recommendations. And I think people will be quite interested to do something about them once they get them, but it will still be up to Congress and the administration to make, to cut costs, to reduce the federal workforce if that's what they want to do, eliminate certain roles that are no longer needed. The return to office mandate for federal employees is one example of something that they will recommend and that will have an impact on the federal budget to some extent, but limited. But they will be considering major questions such as, do we still need a Department of Education? What's their role really? What's the role of the Department of Agriculture? Should it change? I mean, we set that up in the 30s, 100 years ago. Let's reconsider it, I think is going to be a major question. So that's all going to take a lot of time. There's really nothing that we're seeing that is going to play out anytime but prior to, what's going to be the end of the Trump administration, probably. Mike, would you agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree, Pete. And one of the concerns, though, I live here in the Washington, D.C. area, and there are a lot of federal government workers, and a number of them here are aware their roles are going to be scrutinized, changed, and possibly eliminated. So they're kind of walking on eggshells here right now, concerned about their future as a government employees. But you have some new leaders of these key agencies who have now different agendas than their predecessors. So I mentioned Lori Chavez de Remmer, Keith Sonderling, and the Department of Labor. Department of Labor has been kind of like a focal point for conservatives, which the Trump administration is from the Republican Party, which is generally considered conservative. That really a lot of the rules and regulations in the Labor Department are overbearing on employers, and they kind of cut the ability to economically have success. Because of all the requirements that are laid out for employers when it comes to how they handle employees. So they've been kind of in a target for a while. I think we can see that recent legislation that passed under the Biden administration actually provided more funding to the Labor Department to do enforcement, to add staff and things like that. I think we can see a lot of scrutiny going into that. Same thing with the Department of Treasury, the Internal Revenue Service, for example, and others. They have different agendas than the leaders will have different agendas than their predecessors. And part of that agenda is how let's cut the fat out of these processes. And the challenge with the IRS, of course, is that the main intake of revenue for the country goes through the Internal Revenue Service and the processes that they've set out for employers and businesses and individuals. They will, be attempting to modify some of these traditional missions of these regulatory bodies. And you've actually maybe have heard in the last couple of days, President Trump is talking about creating a whole new agency, the External Revenue Agency, that would, kind of replace the U.S. Customs and Border Protection collection process of foreign revenues on tariffs and things like that. He hasn't said whether this, this new agency or whether the IRS would cease collecting some foreign revenues under this plan, as far as I've been reading. But this is the unpredictability that I was talking about earlier, is that something like this could come up, and that can totally change how the administration of some of these key functions that affect payroll. And another key thing that could be changing here. So when we talk about changing a mission, the Labor Department may move from an agency primarily concerned with, upholding the Fair Labor Standards Act, protecting workers from abusive employers, to one that really is focused on helping employers with their abilities to hire and be more flexible with their workforce. Conservatives have complained for years that the Labor Department, like I mentioned, have been constraining economic growth. So we may see, for example, a push to add a compensatory time component to the overtime requirement under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Right now, federal workers workers that work for the federal government, can choose if they work overtime, if they're eligible for overtime and they work overtime, that they can, instead of getting the time and a half pay for that amount over 40 hours, they would end up getting, they could choose to bank those hours and use that later as time off, compensatory time. So this has been debated before for the private sector, allowing private sector employers to do that. And the atmosphere, I think, is right now for that. And we'll likely see less of a focus on enforcement with these policy shifts, as we observed in the first Trump administration. And maybe support services for payroll could be, affected by some of the staffing cuts and the budget cuts.
So we had a question from Amy, which was, do you think there are going to be government layoffs in 2025? And I think, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but potentially there's going to be a lot of change. But one of the things that I suppose a lot of people have joined today's LinkedIn Live is to really understand what laws affecting payroll are likely to be changed or adjusted. Pete, can you start this one off?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there's one that I consider kind of a headliner, a very obvious target. And this is the Trump administration's probably one of their proudest moments, is that they came up with a fairly significant comprehensive tax bill, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that actually was implemented in such a way that it was implemented for a certain number of years. It expires after 2025. So it has to be replaced one way or the other. It doesn't have to be. I mean, if they can't do anything, the law reverts to pre-2017. It just goes back to what it was. And there's a lot of questions, a lot of things change with that. I mean, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had a lot of elements that affected payroll. So I'll go over that in a little bit of detail. Generally, it included, much lower personal and corporate income tax rates, but it also, for example, eliminated personal exemptions from income tax withholding calculations. So that's, clear payroll right there. That's equivalent to 4,150 deduction per person. That may actually come back. But if so, here's the question: what do you do with that? Do you need a new Form W-4? When the TCJA was enacted, the IRS spent a few years reconsidering, what do we do in terms of withholding calculations, and they came out with a whole new Form W-4. They did it in such a way that not everybody had to complete one, though, right? So you have, in the United States today, you have a mixed bag of employees and payroll systems, and most employees never did change their W-4. A lot of employees did use the new W-4, and if we, depending on what happens this year for 2026 and forward, do you still have one W-4? Do you have two? Do you have three? If you have three, do you have to start keeping track of which version each person signed in order to get the withholding calculations right? So major questions there that will play out. We need to understand, but there are other elements as well to just consider. Like, for example, the TCJA, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, repealed the Affordable Care Act individual mandate penalty, the IRS penalty for not having health coverage at an individual level. So they repealed that penalty. There is no federal penalty. There is a state penalty in a half a dozen states that enacted a similar ACA law, like in California, New Jersey, Rhode Island. DC has it, I think. But they may need to, extend, renew that particular repeal. Otherwise, people are going to start paying, again, IRS penalties if they don't have health coverage starting next year. So that's a big question. But, many other elements, and there's a lot. But for example, it doubled the standard deduction to almost to $12,000 for single filers, $24,000 for married couples. Is that going to revert to the much, much lower level? And that caused lots and lots of people to be able to drop their itemized deductions. There was a generous tax credit for employers for offering paid leave. Does that go away? Does that get renewed? Lots of questions in those areas. I mentioned the Secure 2.0, the retirement plan changes. There's a tax exemption for retirement savings, right? That'll have to be reconsidered in the context of you're doing a major tax bill. They generally look at every significant cost, tax expenditure, and retirement savings is like one of the top three. So the federal government is spending literally $286 billion a year as an incentive for people to save for retirement. So question, is that appropriate? Is it necessary? Who does it benefit? Does it arguably benefit the wealthy, the folks that already have plenty of retirement savings? So, we're spending $286 billion every year for this incentive. Might that change? And I think it might. Like as with Secure 2.0, you start to see people saying, well, why don't we switch, at least for higher income individuals, maybe retirement savings should be after tax, not pre-tax. So I think that's one of the questions that's kind of likely this upcoming year. They're going to consider that and maybe switch retirement plan savings. Similarly, employed people, strangely, get a huge tax benefit from their employer-sponsored health coverage. Like if you get family coverage through your employer, that's like worth $15,000 a year. That's tax-free to you. Why are employed people getting that tax benefit, but not those who are not employed, who are paying on an after-tax basis for their health coverage? So again, they'll look at that question. We're spending and the exclusion for employer-provided health coverage is, again, one of the top three tax expenditures of the United States. So they will undoubtedly look at that and say, well, is that appropriate? Maybe we should means test it. Maybe we should provide the tax benefit only for those who need it. So things like that are somewhat likely to change. But again, I'd say that the tax bill, the TCJA, Tax Credit Jobs Act replacement, is going to take up all the air in the room for the next few months as we approach 2026. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there are at least a dozen provisions in that old Tax Cut and Jobs Act that directly affected payroll operations, and And, it might end up being, Pete, that there's, some of them get changed and some of them revert back. I mean, I'm thinking about possibly the moving expense deduction, and those kind of things might change back. Who knows? But there are a lot of moving parts in that that people are going to need to keep paying attention to, because the arguments and the discussions about what gets passed, these proposals are coming out this year and they need to pass this year, or else, yes, on January 1, 2026, if nothing is passed, everything kind of reverts back to what it was like in 2017. And that includes tax rates. Some of the tax rates were cut a little bit too. So, but in addition to that, add to the mix, okay, for this Tax Cut and Jobs Act is the campaign promises to eliminate the income tax on tips, given to tip workers, and also to not federally income tax overtime pay. So there have been proposals introduced already in Congress. Now, they would have tremendous impact on payroll. So either or both of these proposals get signed into law. I'm not going to get into details of it, but we have a system here in the United States where there's the federal income tax, and then there's the Social Security tax, or what sometimes they call that just payroll taxes, which are that fund the Social Security program. And so there are some aspects of these proposals that say, okay, we're going to eliminate income tax, the federal income tax on these things, but the Social Security tax continues. So payroll would still need to be tracking and all that, and accruing and then reporting on all these amounts that accumulate over the year, and that are not taxed for federal, but still remain taxable on these other areas. So those could get worked into legislation extending the Tax Cut and Jobs Act.
That's almost a favorite topic of mine. We actually went through.
I know you want to talk about Alabama, right?
Yeah, we went through that with Alabama. The state of Alabama actually enacted an exemption on overtime pay. And one of the first things we determined was nobody knows how much they were paid in overtime last year. You ask anybody, like, how much were you paid in overtime if you were to make that tax exempt? Nobody knows. So employers are going to have to come up with some sort of a new statement saying, hey, your total overtime pay for last year was X. If they were to do that, not the worst thing in the world. It's possible, but difficult to audit. It's difficult. It's subject to abuse. I can see some employers saying, how do we, can we maybe be more, have a policy, an overtime pay policy that is more generous than is required by the Fair Labor Standards Act? If we do that, we're going to differentiate ourselves. We're going to be the employer that's paying out more of their earnings are tax exempt than other employers. And so you'll see kind of a race to adopt really pro overtime policies for that reason. Same thing for tips. He's promised to exempt tips, which, okay, that would be beneficial for those who earn tips to some extent, but again, difficult to administer, subject to gaming. There's a lot of ways that employers might shift the focus in their compensation packages of, can we pay less in wages and somehow at least describe more of what we're paying out as in the nature of tips that would be exempt from tax. Anyway, a lot of craziness goes along with those kinds of proposals, but we'll see. We actually, last year, there were maybe 10 states that proposed an exemption very similar to Alabama's. We, kind of stopped and pointed out the difficulties associated with that, and none of them ended up adopting it because it is fairly complicated for taxpayers, for tax preparers, for employers, and for the agencies to administer. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and for payroll, when we look at these proposals, the devil's going to be in the details. Like you mentioned, Pete, what constitutes a tip? Will it be broad enough definition that people can just drive a truck through it, or will it be a very narrow? And to what kind of workers will it be? All the service workers anybody who gets a tip, or will it be just a certain segment?
Mhm.
And that could cause a lot of complications on as they move forward in determining whether this kind of initiative is actually going to see the light of day and get passed into law.
Okay.
We may see some activity on paid leave. I'm changing the subject here. Currently, there's no federal law requiring employers to provide paid leave for illness or holiday or otherwise. But the previous Trump administration did float a proposal for new parents to have paid leave that ended up not going anywhere. But that could be reintroduced this cycle. And we'll talk about actually how states have kind of stepped up a bit on filling the gap in terms of requiring employers to provide certain types of paid leave and things like that. Another activity area I can see is there might be some changes in laws related to payments in general, things that are going to help accelerate payments, employee payments for one, but also use of crypto and virtual currencies. Those kind of things are going to have more of I predict, have a little more of a currency, so to speak, with this administration than the previous administration. Pete?
Yeah, let me just add a little bit to your comments on the role of state, local requirements and paid leave, because that is a very hot topic. It's a hot topic at federal level, even though not much is being done on it, but that may change. So I think we are now seeing large business organizations now seeking federal legislation because the states have been so active on that topic. There's been maybe a dozen states with legislation. Some of them are in operation already. Some of them are being implemented this year, but they're quite complex. Again, arguably, the question is arguably, employers should pay for people to take time off if they're sick or their families are sick. So that's, can't argue with that. There is no federal law to that effect, right? So that's kind of a surprise in this day and age, but because Congress hasn't been able to enact legislation along those lines, the states have. And guess what? Their laws are incredibly diverse. They're very difficult in many respects, in terms of, who is covered, which employers are covered. What about nonprofits? What about churches? What about government entities? Are they covered? Are they required to provide paid leave? Which employees are covered? State laws vary all over the place in terms of which workers are subject to this mandate. Who constitutes a family member? If you're taking leave for a family member, who could be a family member qualifying for leave? What types of circumstances qualify for paid leave? Is it just illness? There are many, many other reasons that people should arguably have paid time off. But, so these states have, kind of debated this and come up with their own unique answers, which is great. But if you're a multi-state employer, good luck. It's really complicated to administer with. Every state law is different, and your payroll systems have to handle them differently. What constitutes wages subject to any tax for paid leave, things like that, varies considerably. So again, no surprise, you have a dozen states that do something very, very different, and the largest national employers are going to Congress saying, can you do something to preempt this, or come up with a federal program, a single federal program that does what we agree should be done without the complications of a hodgepodge of diverse state laws.
Right, and we already have those diverse state laws with minimum wage too. So, but the paid leave is much more complicated, Pete, as you mentioned. I mean, because there are kind of two different angles states are taking to that. One is a paid family leave type of approach that almost like a deduction from pay for employees that to pay into a fund so that they can draw on that later if they have an issue. And then there are just the straight outright mandates that say, hey, employer, you must provide a paid leave program to your employees if they work a certain amount of time. Here are the accrual levels, and they all vary. And it's the same thing with the minimum wage and other issues. States, unfortunately, have to lead the way on some of these policies, and that complicates payroll administration. But there's also, earned wage access. There are a couple of states that call such arrangements a loan. You mentioned the states that don't, but there are a couple of states out there that are, classifying these arrangements as a loan for earned wage access. So unfortunately, the lack of consistency and clarity are the worst things for payroll, of course. And I wrote a story for the GPA about the challenge multi-state payroll operations face in meeting these very requirements for paid leave laws. That was a few months back, but it's going to continue to be an issue until the federal government actually steps up and fills that out so that it can be applied across the country.
Let me add one more point, which is different, but I think we'd be remiss not mentioning it. But that is that the United States Social Security system is really overdue for an overhaul. Like last major bill was 1983, quite a while ago. And, what we have now is kind of a growing imbalance between the number of retirees and the number of workers. And, it used to be when we originally enacted Social Security in 1935, whatever, there were dozens, if not 100, workers per retiree. Now it's flipped. Now there are 3 active workers for every active retiree, and that's going to shift to 2 active workers to every 1 retiree by 2030. So not a lot of people paying in, a lot of people getting the benefits. So statistically, by 2035, the Tax Foundation determined that the Social Security Trust Fund will be depleted, and without reforms, those beneficiaries, those who receive Social Security, are going to have like a 17% cut in benefits if they don't do something about that. So going broke by 2033, that's not quite in this next administration, but it should be, right? I mean, the earlier you can address something like this, the easier it is. But to fix that, they would have to increase the payroll tax by like 3.5 points. Literally, like it's currently 6.2%. Would have to go to like 9.7% tax rate to cover the shortfall. The other change is, do we change the taxable limit? Currently, the tax rate of 6.2% applies to the first 176,100 in earnings for 2025. So in other words, the tax rate becomes 0 after somebody has made 176,000, basically. So, why is that? Is that appropriate? And there are some who would like to restart that taxable wage recalculation so that, yes, there's still a limit. Maybe it's up to 176 at 6.2%. But maybe if you make more than $400,000, and that 400,000 was something that was suggested by the Biden administration, is they wouldn't increase taxes over that. It's not necessarily binding on the current administration or the Trump administration when they come in. But it's been vetted. A lot of people talked about it. It's been kind of broadly accepted. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the Trump administration just continue with that and say, well, that's a reasonable level. Maybe tax restarts at 400,000. So employer payroll systems would have to reprogram so that they tax up to a certain limit and then continue to accrue and then tax over a certain other amount. So anyway, this is going to be on the agenda over the next few years and really has to be fixed soon.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to take in, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of changes. And I think there's many countries around the world that are maybe feeling how you guys are feeling with all the change coming in. As always, when a new government comes in, I like Josie's comment. I think we should leave it there. It's very complicated as a multi-state employer. So I think everyone's going to agree with that. I think we come to a natural end. So thank you so much for Pete and Mike sharing your knowledge and your expertise. And thank you to everyone that's joined us. We had a great expanse of people from all around the world. And I think India, you guys should be asleep. But thank you so much from everyone that's joined us from India. We will be running another session soon, again, for the States. and we will let you know once that's been organised. But thank you. If you want to contact Pete or Mike, you have their LinkedIn profiles, so I'm sure they'll be happy to have any direct messages from you. You've also got my email address, so please feel free to email me. But thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. See you later.
Thank you.